The moment the truth started slipping through the cracks, it didn't arrive with a press release or a royal announcement. It arrived through silence. The kind of silence that suffocates a room and leaves everyone staring at each other, realizing something catastrophic has just unfolded behind closed doors. Because this was never just about a podcast deal collapsing or a few executives quietly distancing themselves. This was about a $25 million illusion that had been sold to the world as revolutionary, only to unravel into something executives reportedly refused to even discuss publicly. And behind that illusion stood two figures who had promised to disrupt the monarchy, reshape media, and build an empire, but instead found themselves trapped in a spiral of broken contracts, whispered accusations, and a brand that insiders say began collapsing long before anyone outside realized. It was happening. It began with hope, or at least the performance of hope. When Spotify signed that massive $25 million agreement, it wasn't just buying content, it was buying access. Access to royalty, access to secrets, access to the raw emotional machinery of a royal exit that had already electrified the world. Executives imagined a pipeline of exclusive revelations, deeply personal storytelling, and cultural influence that would dominate global conversations. But what they allegedly received instead was something far quieter, far thinner, and far more unsettling. Months of waiting, endless delays, and an output so minimal that insiders began privately questioning whether there had ever been a real production machine behind the promise at all. And that's when the whispers started. Whispers that would eventually grow loud enough to shake the foundation of the entire deal. Inside Spotify, frustration reportedly grew with each passing month. Meetings that were supposed to showcase progress instead turned into exercises in reassurance, vague updates, shifting timelines, and promises that the next phase would finally deliver what had been expected all along. But the delivery never came in the way executives had envisioned. Instead, there were only a handful of episodes, far fewer than anyone had anticipated, and even those began to attract scrutiny for reasons no one outside the inner circles could have imagined. Because what was being presented as deeply personal storytelling allegedly began to show signs of something else entirely, a carefully constructed narrative that insiders quietly questioned behind the scenes. The real shock came when internal reviews reportedly revealed details that executives had never anticipated when they signed that deal. The podcast that had been marketed as intimate and authentic was now being examined with forensic precision, and what executives allegedly discovered was something that fundamentally changed their perception of the entire partnership. Questions began circulating about how much direct involvement there had actually been, about who had truly shaped the content, and about whether the authenticity that had been promised was real or simply a carefully assembled illusion designed to preserve an image. And once those questions began, they didn't stop. Behind the polished public image, tensions reportedly escalated rapidly. Executives who had once celebrated the partnership now found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality. The numbers weren't matching the expectations, the momentum wasn't building, and the brand that had been sold as unstoppable was beginning to look alarmingly fragile. Internally, discussions shifted from expansion to containment, from long-term strategy to damage control. The energy had changed. What had once been a crown jewel partnership was now quietly becoming a liability no one wanted to openly acknowledge. And then came the moment that insiders say marked the beginning of the end, the decision to terminate the deal. Publicly, it was framed as a business decision, the kind that happens in an industry driven by performance metrics and evolving priorities. But privately, according to insiders familiar with the aftermath, the termination carried a deeper significance. It wasn't just the end of a contract, it was the collapse of a narrative, the shattering of an image that had been carefully maintained since the moment they stepped away from royal life. Because this wasn't just about losing Spotify, it was about losing credibility. Executives who had once championed the partnership reportedly began distancing themselves from it entirely, unwilling to publicly revisit what had gone wrong. Conversations that had once been filled with excitement were now replaced with silence, the kind of silence that signals regret. And in the corridors of power where billion-dollar decisions are made, silence is never accidental. It's deliberate. It's protective. It's the sound of people choosing not to say what they already know cannot be undone. But the fallout didn't stop there. Because once the Spotify deal collapsed, it triggered a chain reaction that spread across every corner of their carefully constructed empire. Other partners began watching closely, analyzing the situation, reassessing their own commitments. Confidence began to erode, slowly at first, then all at once. And suddenly, the brand that had once been seen as unstoppable was now being viewed through a very different lens, one shaped not by promise, but by performance. The most devastating part wasn't the public headlines or the official statements. It was what insiders allegedly said when the cameras weren't rolling. The quiet acknowledgement that what had been sold as a revolutionary media venture had failed to meet the expectations of the very executives who had believed in it most. And in an industry built on perception, that kind of internal shift is often impossible to recover from, because perception is everything. It determines who gets the next deal, who gets the next opportunity, who remains relevant, and who quietly fades into irrelevance. And once perception begins to shift, once doubt begins to replace confidence, the collapse becomes almost inevitable. What makes this story even more explosive is the timing, because as the corporate partnerships began collapsing, another storm was already forming, one rooted not in media contracts but in legal battles, allegations, and a monarchy that insiders say had finally decided to stop absorbing the damage and start fighting back. The lawsuit that emerged wasn't just another headline, it was a signal that the quiet tolerance of the past had ended, replaced by something far more aggressive and far more permanent. And suddenly, everything was connected. The failed deals, the legal battles, the collapsing brand, the silence from executives who once spoke so confidently about the future. It was no longer just a business story. It was a collapse playing out in real time, across continents, across industries, across institutions that had once seemed untouchable. Because in the end, the most devastating thing wasn't that the deal had failed. It was that the failure had exposed something deeper, something that executives reportedly saw but refused to discuss publicly. A realization that what they had invested in wasn't the unstoppable force they had believed it to be, but something far more fragile, far more dependent on perception than reality. And by the time that realization became impossible to ignore, the damage had already been done. And just when it seemed like the damage couldn't possibly deepen any further, the truth behind the Spotify disaster began bleeding into every other corner of their carefully engineered empire, exposing a pattern that executives, partners, and insiders had allegedly begun whispering about long before the public ever caught wind of it. Because the Spotify collapse wasn't an isolated event, it was the first domino in a chain reaction that would send shockwaves through Netflix boardrooms, publishing houses, and royal corridors, forcing everyone to confront a question that had once seemed unthinkable. What if the brand that had commanded global fascination was never as stable as it appeared? Behind closed doors, executives reportedly began revisiting everything: the original pitches, the promises, the carefully curated presentations that had convinced them to sign those massive deals in the first place. They remembered the urgency, the exclusivity, the sense that they were witnessing the birth of a media powerhouse unlike anything the industry had seen before. But now, with hindsight sharpening their perspective, those same executives were allegedly seeing something else: missed deadlines, inconsistent delivery, and a growing gap between what had been promised and what had actually materialized. And the more they examined that gap, the harder it became to ignore the implications. Because in Hollywood and Silicon Valley, failure doesn't just damage one deal, it reshapes reputations. And once the Spotify partnership ended, other partners began quietly reassessing their own relationships. Netflix, which had once embraced the couple with open arms and massive financial backing, reportedly began examining performance metrics with a level of scrutiny that insiders described as unusually intense. Internal analytics revealed uncomfortable truths, declining viewer retention, diminishing engagement, and content that failed to sustain the explosive momentum that had initially captivated audiences. Executives who had once envisioned a steady stream of compelling documentaries, series, and original productions were now reportedly confronting the reality that the pipeline was drying up. Projects that had once been announced with excitement were quietly shelved, delayed indefinitely, or canceled altogether. Meetings that had once focused on expansion now focused on containment. And just like Spotify, Netflix began moving cautiously, strategically distancing itself from a partnership that had lost its original shine. But the most devastating blow wasn't financial, it was psychological. Because when powerful institutions begin pulling back, it sends a signal to the entire industry. Agents notice, studios notice, investors notice, and suddenly opportunities that once appeared automatically begin disappearing. Calls that once came in daily become less frequent. Invitations stop arriving. The silence begins creeping in, slowly but unmistakably. And while the corporate world was recalibrating its relationship with the Sussex brand, another storm was brewing in London, one that threatened to redefine the entire narrative. Because behind palace walls, patience had reportedly run out. For years, the monarchy had maintained its policy of silence, refusing to engage publicly, refusing to escalate, refusing to validate the conflict. But silence, insiders say, had come at a cost. Every interview, every memoir excerpt, every documentary revelation had chipped away at the institution's image, creating a slow bleed that could no longer be ignored. That's when the decision was allegedly made, a decision that insiders describe as both calculated and inevitable. The lawsuit filed by Prince William wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a declaration that the era of passive endurance was over. It was the monarchy's way of reclaiming control over a narrative that had spiraled beyond its influence. And suddenly, what had once been a family dispute transformed into a legal war with consequences far beyond personal grievances. For Harry, the implications were enormous. Because this wasn't just about defending his words, it was about defending his credibility, his financial stability, and his future. Legal battles of this magnitude carry enormous costs, not just financially, but reputationally. Every allegation would be examined, every contract scrutinized, every decision questioned, and with each passing day, the pressure intensified. Meanwhile, Meghan reportedly began shifting her strategy. Insiders claim she understood something critical, that survival depended on distance. Public appearances became carefully curated, projecting calm, projecting confidence, projecting an image of someone untouched by the chaos unfolding around her. But behind the scenes, insiders allege a different reality. One filled with urgent meetings, strategic repositioning, and preparations for a future that looked dramatically different from the one they had once envisioned. Because the collapse wasn't just external, it was internal. The brand they had built together was now under siege from every direction, corporate, legal, and public. And as the pressure mounted, the unity that had once defined their public image reportedly began showing cracks. The financial implications alone were staggering. With major deals collapsing and legal costs rising, the economic foundation that had supported their independence was weakening. The promise of limitless opportunity had been replaced by the reality of finite resources. And for the first time since their dramatic exit from royal life, the possibility of long-term financial instability began to loom. But perhaps the most devastating consequence wasn't financial or legal, it was existential. Because everything they had built since leaving the monarchy had been designed to prove one thing: that they could thrive on their own terms, that they could redefine their identity without relying on royal status. And now, with deals collapsing and lawsuits advancing, that narrative was under threat. The world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Would they recover? Would they rebuild? Or would the collapse continue, dragging their brand deeper into irrelevance? Inside royal circles, insiders reportedly believed the outcome was already inevitable. The monarchy, strengthened by centuries of survival, had weathered crises far greater than this. And now, with legal action underway and public sentiment shifting, it was positioning itself not as the wounded party, but as the institution reclaiming its authority. Because in the end, this wasn't just about Spotify. It wasn't just about Netflix. It wasn't just about contracts or lawsuits or headlines. It was about power, who had it, who lost it, and who would ultimately control the story that remained when everything else had fallen away. And as the legal battle moved forward, one truth became impossible to ignore. The illusion that had once captivated the world was fading, replaced by a reality far harsher and far more permanent. The empire that had been built on promise was now standing on unstable ground, and every passing moment brought it closer to a reckoning that insiders say could change everything forever. Change everything forever. Change everything forever. Change everything forever.